A legendary man with a legendary band, Van Halen is responsible for some of the greatest songs in rock music. But what are you missing from the group's long history? If you're a real fan, this is what you need to know.
You probably can't tell, but Michael Jackson's infectious Beat It was his first ever attempt at a rock song. But the King of Pop's Ode to Street Life might have never charted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 if it wasn't for the memorable work of hard rock guitarist Eddie Van Halen. In 1982, the anti-disco movement was strong, so Jackson and his producer Quincy Jones were looking for something that would give him a harder edge and set his next record apart. Jones tasked him with penning a rock song in the mold of the Knack's mega-hit My Sharona for his upcoming album Thriller. Who might you enlist if you're a legendary pop superstar dipping your toe into the rock genre? For Michael Jackson, it was none other than legendary guitarist Eddie Van Halen.
Wow, Van Halen, who else?
Eddie Van Halen's iconic guitar riff is now known as the centerpiece of Beat It, but when Quincy Jones approached Van Halen to record the track, he thought it was a joke. According to Stereo Gum, Eddie Van Halen reportedly hung up on and cursed at Quincy Jones 4 times before realizing it wasn't a prank call. While Eddie Van Halen usually avoided taking any side gigs while working with his band Van Halen, he agreed to the collaboration, but he had 2 rules. Van Halen wouldn't be credited, and Jackson wouldn't tell the rest of his bandmates. As Thriller and its hit Beat It climbed the charts, Eddie Van Halen was shocked to see it outpace his band's own album 1984. Van Halen later told CNN in 2012, "I said to myself, who is going to know that I played on this kid's record, right? Nobody's going to find out." Wrong. Big time wrong. It ended up being Record of the Year. Then, Eddie Van Halen found himself perusing a Tower record store in Sherman Oaks, Los Angeles when Beat It came on over the stereo. Some nearby customers mused that the song's guitar solo sounded almost exactly like the playing of Van Halen himself. He reportedly tapped the record store kids on the shoulder and fessed up that it was him. Naturally, his bandmates caught wind of Eddie's contribution, even if he went uncredited on the album. He offered his Van Halen bandmates a few excuses for his pop interlude. "I just said, busted. Dave, you were out of the country. Al, you weren't around. I couldn't call anyone and ask for permission." Van Halen's street cred was safe. His bandmates let it pass, but not without first razzing him about one huge mistake. Turns out, Eddie Van Halen had never asked to be paid for what was now the #1 song in the United States. He had agreed in the end to play on the track, perform a guitar solo, and rework the arrangement for the entire track. While Eddie Van Halen's 20-second guitar solo on Beat It seems to transcend all space and time, in fact, it only took the legend half an hour to record. Of course, not without rearranging the entire song first. According to CNN, Quincy Jones told Van Halen to do, quote, "whatever you want to do."
That is why we need Eddie Van Halen.
After an initial listen to the rough track, Van Halen chopped different sections of the chorus and reworked the middle of the song, and then promptly recorded 2 masterful blazing guitar solos on top. Instead of thinking that Van Halen had butchered his new track, Michael Jackson was grateful for the contribution. Van Halen recalled to CNN that Jackson told him he made the song that much better.
And Michael came in and I said, "Oh, I hope you don't mind, I changed your song." And he listens and he goes, "No, I really like that high-fast stuff you do."
Eddie Van Halen's hand in the crossover hit soon took on a mythic quality. In the final cut of the track, you can hear a knocking sound right before Van Halen's guitar solo shreds through. As Stereo Gum points out, many fans attributed the knock to Eddie Van Halen, possibly drunk and impatient to be let into the recording studio. But that part of the legend is supposedly just legend.
It hasn't been good times all the time for Van Halen. They've endured lineup changes, the consequences of a rock and roll lifestyle, and plenty of health scares. Here are some of the most tragic moments in Van Halen's history. While Van Halen was named after brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen, their breakout star was colorful lead singer David Lee Roth. He was always good for a quippy quote, bouncing around on stage, and mugging for the cameras. But then in 1985, he left the band, a year after the release of their most successful album, 1984.
Why'd you leave? Why did I bail? I'm a workaholic. I like to travel. I like to go on the road.
That left the rest of Van Halen scrambling to find a new lead singer to keep that gravy train rolling. Several of the band's initial choices turned down the gig, which eventually went to hard rock solo artist Sammy Hagar. Patti Smith of the band Scandal was one of those choices. She told Delaware's News Journal in 2014, "They had asked me not to talk about it in interviews at the time because they didn't want Sammy Hagar to feel like he was the second choice." Another interesting selection that could have been was the honey-voiced Daryl Hall of Blue-Eyed Soul duo Hall & Oates. When Hagar was a guest on Hall's show Live at Darrell's House, he asked Hall about the rumor that he'd been asked to join his old band, which Hall confirmed. Not long after the stressful departure of Roth in 1985, Eddie and Alex Van Halen endured a far more taxing ordeal. Their father, Jan Van Halen, suffered a heart attack in May 1986 and then died in December of that year at the age of 66. In a 1988 profile in Rolling Stone, Eddie indicated that a problem with alcohol contributed to his father's death. His passing, as well as the time Eddie was forced to stay in the hospital for tropical fever, made him take a long, hard look at himself. As he put it, "That kind of made me look at things a little different. Imagining being in there for an OD or alcohol, like my dad died from, it kind of wised me up." Their father's death shook Alex as well, who enjoyed a reputation as the hardest partier of anyone in the band. He also quit drinking around 1986 and admitted that he didn't want to end up like The Who's Keith Moon or Led Zeppelin's John Bonham, two other legendary rock drummers who died from complications from excessive alcohol consumption. Bassist Michael Anthony's relationship with Eddie Van Halen started to suffer in the late 90s when the band parted with Sammy Hagar and briefly united with David Lee Roth. Hagar had started a new band called Planet Us and had asked Anthony if he'd like to join. Van Halen took that to mean that Anthony had quit. Flash forward to 2004, when Van Halen wanted to tour with Hagar and they asked Anthony to get the jilted singer to sign on. However, if Anthony wanted to be a part of it, he'd have to sign away his legal rights to Van Halen's band name and take a pay cut.
It's really irritating to see them go after Mikey. Mikey didn't do anything ever to Van Halen. Mikey was the most loyal guy in the band.
3 years later, Van Halen hit the road again, this time with Roth, but without Anthony, who found out about the tour when it was reported in the press. The band's newest bassist was Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's teenage son. On top of that, Eddie refuted Anthony's version of the events to Rolling Stone, saying, "When Hagar left the band, Mike went with him. Then when we get back together with Dave and all of a sudden he wants back in, it's like, no dude, you quit the band." But that wasn't how Anthony saw it. He told Music Radar in 2009 that he simply never quit Van Halen. Van Halen has a reputation for being a nightmare on tour, and with that in mind, perhaps the most famous bit of Van Halen lore is the no brown M&Ms rule. The band's 1982 rider included a stipulation that their backstage bowl of M&Ms must be totally free of any brown candies. This wasn't Van Halen acting like a bunch of divas, however. In 2012, David Lee Roth explained that the band's touring show was difficult to set up in a timely manner because the crews in each town were inexperienced with assembling a massive rock and roll setup. So Roth asked his managers to place a clause in the rider banning brown M&Ms. If he spotted the candies in the bowl, it provided proof that the promoter hadn't read the rider, and the band would have to do a serious line check to make sure all of the stage equipment had been installed safely and correctly. If people didn't pay attention to the contract, that led to some bad consequences. For example, at Van Halen's 1980 show in Pueblo, Colorado, when Roth went backstage and found brown M&Ms, he absolutely destroyed the dressing room. As it turns out, he had every right to be mad that the promoters hadn't carefully read the contract. In addition to the M&Ms, the arena's shock-absorbent floor couldn't handle the weight of Van Halen's gear. Even though the floor's requirements were laid out in the rider, organizers ignored that section too, and tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage was done to the area floor. In their 70s and 80s heyday, the members of Van Halen would play a concert in the evening and then they'd go out and party afterward. Everyone, that is, except Eddie Van Halen, who would stay back in his hotel room to write songs, work on guitar riffs, and ingest copious amounts of vodka and cocaine. In 2015, he told Billboard, "I would use them for work. The blow keeps you awake, and the alcohol lowers your inhibitions. I was an alcoholic, and I needed alcohol to function." Of course, this sometimes backfired, as Eddie once got so wasted that he couldn't even play. His descent into addiction began at a very young age. He started drinking and smoking when he was 12. During his high school years, he would even get drunk before showing up to class. In 1988, he told Rolling Stone about the alcohol-related death of his father that led him to kicking booze, but the sobriety didn't last. By 2004, he turned into, as he told Billboard, an angry drunk. 3 years later, he checked himself into a rehabilitation center, which precluded him from attending Van Halen's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So many rock stars have married famous actresses that it feels like it just must be the natural order of things. In 1980, 20-year-old Valerie Bertinelli, at the time one of the stars of the popular sitcom One Day at a Time, met guitar master Eddie Van Halen backstage at one of his shows. The pair then married in April 1981, just 8 months after they became a couple.
Why did that feel like the right move for you back then, to get married at the age of 20 to a rock and roll star?
I was madly in love. Madly in love. I just adored him.
Unfortunately, drugs go hand in hand with rock and roll, and they were also part of this rock and roll marriage before it even started. Bertinelli revealed in her memoir, Losing It and Gaining My Life Back, that as she and Van Halen filled out a pre-marriage questionnaire sent by their wedding officiant, they were holding vials of cocaine. Not long into the marriage, both spouses started to stray. Bertinelli discovered evidence of Van Halen's infidelity when she heard him on the phone talking about how he wanted out of the marriage. She filed for divorce in 2005, 4 years after the two of them had separated. In March 1995, Van Halen hit the road for a long stretch of concerts in support of their album Balance. Eddie Van Halen nicknamed it the Ambulance Tour because both he and his brother were playing through significant pain. While Alex Van Halen ruptured 3 vertebrae in his neck and had to wear a not very rock and roll neck brace for the duration of many shows. Eddie was dealing with tremendous pain in his hip due to avascular necrosis. The guitarist delayed hip replacement surgery for years until he finally went under the knife in November 1999 when he was just 44. He got his brand new bionic from Dr. John R. Moreland, orthopedic surgeon to the stars, who performed similar operations for Liza Minnelli and Elizabeth Taylor. Clearly, there's almost always a painful price to being an aging rock star. Eddie Van Halen was once a habitual chain smoker, and all the cigarettes he went through during recording sessions weren't exactly pleasant for his bandmates. Sammy Hagar described the situation to Ultimate Classic Rock. I would come home midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I would stink so bad with all my long hair. Hair just absorbed cigarettes and my clothes. Van Halen eventually gave up smoking in favor of vaping, a necessary concession considering that a third of his tongue was surgically removed in 2000. The cancer also spread to his throat. In November 2019, he was briefly hospitalized for a health issue relating to the cancer, as he was suffering from abdominal pain, an adverse reaction to some of his cancer drugs. Van Halen has an interesting theory about the cause of his ongoing health crisis. Years of smoking aren't to blame, instead, it's work-related. He told Billboard in 2019, "I used metal picks, they're brass and copper, which I always held in my mouth in the exact place where I got the tongue cancer. Plus, I basically live in a recording studio that's filled with electromagnetic energy." He faced another major health scare in 2012. On August 29th, a message posted to the Van Halen Facebook page read, "Eddie Van Halen underwent an emergency surgery for a severe bout of diverticulitis. No further surgeries are needed, and a full recovery is expected within 4 to 6 months. Symptoms like constant abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, fever, and constipation plagued Eddie, and severe cases require corrective surgery." That's what happened to Van Halen. Sadly, the condition got even worse for the Eruption guitarist. He spent an extra 3 weeks in the hospital after his surgery because of a few blown stitches, leading to an infection in his intestine, a portion of which had to be removed by doctors. Van Halen spent months recovering at home, forcing the cancellation of the rest of his band's 2012 tour dates. In the early 1980s, Alex Van Halen was briefly married to a woman named Valerie Kendall. Eventually, the two broke up, but that wouldn't be his only divorce. In 1984, he married Kelly Carter. Their union ended in 1996, but there were even more legal headaches to come. In 2013, ELVH Inc., the band's intellectual property company, sued Kelly Carter, or more accurately, Kelly Van Halen. Over a decade after her divorce, she was still using Van Halen as her professional last name. She started a construction, fashion, and interior design company named Kelly Van Halen, which, according to ELVH, constituted trademark infringement. The company also complained that putting the name Kelly Van Halen on a line of blankets, bathing suits, and armoires was confusingly similar to the sound, appearance, and commercial impression of Van Halen the rock band. After years of legal battles, all parties settled the matter out of court.
Eddie Van Halen and Dimebag Darrell Abbott were phenomenal guitarists the world was sad to let go. Dimebag Darrell was tragically shot in 2004, while Eddie Van Halen struggled with throat cancer for years before the disease eventually took his life on October 6, 2020. Both came from prominent rock bands, and both knew of each other's talents. Dimebag had been a fan of the entire Van Halen crew for a long time.
It was pretty mainstream heavy metal for me, you know, like Iron Maiden, Van Halen, Black Sabbath, of course, you know, like that.
Meanwhile, Eddie Van Halen had embraced his fellow guitarist. Van Halen and Dimebag Darrell had only known each other for a few weeks before Dimebag Darrell's tragic onstage murder at the hands of a gun-wielding fan. But Van Halen clearly came to respect both Darrell Abbott as a person and Dimebag Darrell as a musician. There isn't much else that could explain how the two of them got so close in such a limited amount of time. The two guitarists were each part of a pair of brothers playing guitar and drums in their bands. Eddie Van Halen and Alex Van Halen were the founding members of Van Halen, while Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul Abbott both played for Pantera and Damageplan. Both sets of brothers were quite close to each other, and according to Vinnie Paul, hit it off right away when they met each other. Vinnie Paul told Team Rock that the last words he and his brother said to each other before Dimebag's tragic death were, "Van Halen." It was a mantra of theirs that reminded them to, quote, "let it all hang out and have a good time." Vinnie Paul also talked about the first time Dimebag met Eddie Van Halen. They hung out with Van Halen while they were setting up and doing soundtrack for one of the band's shows, and Dimebag was ecstatic. Vinnie Paul recalled Dimebag's words for Ultimate Classic Rock after the encounter. "My brother looked at me and he goes, 'Man, you know what? If this plane was to go down in a crash right now, I'd be okay with it. I finally got to meet the dude that made me want to play guitar.'" According to his girlfriend, Rena Haney, Dimebag had offered to pay $30,000 for a striped guitar from Eddie's collection, but Eddie turned down the offer, telling Dimebag that he'd make a special one for him instead. After Dimebag Darrell's death, Vinnie Paul and Rita Haney were discussing which guitar to bury Dimebag with. He'd already had a special casket donated by the band Kiss, so a fitting guitar was next on the docket. Eddie Van Halen called and said he'd pick one out just for Darrell, according to Ultimate Classic Rock. Everyone was expecting a replica guitar of the same type that Haney said Dimebag had discussed the night he met Eddie. Instead of the red and white colors, Haney requested yellow and black. Haney told Van Halen, "Darrell always said that the yellow and black was your toughest guitar." Well, there was no way Eddie was going to let Dimebag Darrell rest in peace with a newly striped guitar that had never seen any real action. He had other plans. Eddie came by the day of Dimebag Darrell's funeral with the guitar in hand. It was indeed the yellow and black that Haney had requested, the same iconic guitar he held on the back of the Van Halen 2 album.
He puts his guitar in the casket with Darrell. It's the guitar off of Van Halen 2. You know, the black one with the yellow stripe. I mean, it's the guitar.
Reportedly, he told Haney, quote, "An original should have an original." Van Halen refused to view Dimebag during the ceremony so that he could remember the late guitarist how he had known him in life. Eddie Van Halen then told Dimebag's friends and loved ones, "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else, to give some love back. This guy was full of life. He lived and breathed rock and roll." Ah, the 80s, a decade that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be when it grew up. It was self-referential, outlandish, and a little ashamed of its roots. Disco was roundly derided, despite selling millions of dance tunes. And while video didn't actually kill the radio star, MTV was playing little short films wrapped around music singles, and lots of people took notice. Witness Van Halen. The band composed of brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen on guitar and drums respectively, with Michael Anthony playing bass, and David Lee Roth as singer, frontman, showman, hair. The band gelled in 1974 and cut an album 4 years later with financial backing from Kiss's Gene Simmons, according to Biography. And it sold well, but the real success, and presumably the real money, came with 1984's 1984, which included such chart-smashing cuts as Panama, Jump, and Hot for Teacher, the subject of today's lesson. Music videos were amazingly effective for selling recordings. Some had practically nothing to do with the song itself. Look up Men Without Hats' Safety Dance from 1982 if you don't believe us. While some made at least a passing attempt at a narrative, they also provided an excuse for the band to hang out with very attractive people, like in Hot for Teacher. Roth is credited with co-directing the video, along with Pete Angelis, director on the band's videos for Jump and Panama, says Songfacts. The video begins with Waldo, the already awkward new kid in school who's terrified. And then the teacher walks in, who turns out to be, well, attractive by most standards. The woman playing the teacher with dance moves was Lillian Mueller, a native of Norway who'd already had a decent MTV gig, says Ultimate Classic Rock, as part of Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy 6 years earlier. Mueller had started as a model in Western Europe, appearing, according to her website, in the pages of French Vogue and modeling in London. That led to yet another bit of pop culture infamy. Mueller was named Playboy's Playmate of the Year in 1976. Her website relates that Lillian went on to become the most featured Playmate of the Year in the magazine's history, scoring 9 covers from 1975 to 1999. As for her Hot for Teacher performance, a Guitar World article from 2012 quotes Mueller this way: "I was in my early 30s at the time. I was a little old for the role. That didn't seem to stop anyone." Loudwire relates that 1984 has sold something like 20 million copies, and the official video on YouTube has amassed north of 17 million views. The Hot for Teacher video also has children standing in as young versions of Van Halen members, reportedly a stroke of dramatic genius from Angelus. Waldo himself had a little help in his characterization. The boy's voice was supplied by longtime Saturday Night Live veteran Phil Hartman.
I hope you find some friends this year.
Oh, Mom, you know I'm not like other guys.
There's some dancing involved, of course, including choreography performed by the band under a disco ball. Musical ability doesn't necessarily translate onto the dance floor, however. Drummer Alex Van Halen couldn't get the moves down and is pretty much out of step throughout those shots. Mueller went on to score guest roles on American television for several years, including appearances on the original Magnum P.I. and Fantasy Island, along with a couple of supporting roles in films before moving into a new career arc. She studied at the Actors Studio in Hollywood before launching her brand as a motivational speaker.
My life now is very much about helping people, keep their youth, keep their health, and looking radiant.
She then returned to Norway for more television work, including that country's version of Dancing with the Stars. According to her website, she's published a couple of books, including her autobiography and a volume of advice on personal health for people over the age of 40, all while raising a daughter as a single parent. She claims she's never consumed alcohol and has been a staunch vegetarian since her mid-20s, which perhaps led to her Sexiest Vegetarian Over 50 title in December 2010 from People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Seems like she still has a few things she could teach us.
How could two men who made such magic together in the studio and on stage have so much animosity toward one another over the course of more than 40 years? There is no stereotypical band origin story here in which young friends came together for the love of music. According to Van Halen News Desk, Roth was only invited to join the group because, unlike Eddie Van Halen and drummer Alex Van Halen, he came from money and already owned his own sound system. Eddie was the band's lead singer as well as guitarist. He didn't have the best voice, but he didn't love Roth's voice either. Apparently, the sound system was too much for him to resist. Roth joined the group in 1973 and immediately tried to change things up. While most of Van Halen loved and wanted to play straight-up heavy metal, Roth was also a fan of Motown, the Beach Boys, and funk. The radio-friendly metal of Van Halen would have been impossible without what each other had to offer. Eddie Van Halen, with his stunning finger-tapping technique, Guitar Hero riffs, and serious gift for songwriting, and David Lee Roth with his over-the-top charisma, showmanship, and vocals. They were both arguably the best at what they did, which perhaps contributed to the friction between them. According to Associate Professor of History and Van Halen scholar Greg Renoff, Roth and Van Halen had entirely different ideas about how to be in a rock band and how to succeed in the music business. Renoff explained, "The Van Halens were content making good money playing shows in the Pasadena area that they would promote themselves, while Roth pushed them to audition at clubs and expand their reach. Roth also wanted the band to look more like rock stars and glam up their concerts with stage clothes. This push and pull of personalities and musical philosophies ended up defining the band's sound and image." Renoff further elaborated on the group's chemistry. Of course, they never would have made it without Eddie writing the songs and without their talents, but Roth was the guy who said, "Look at me." Throughout the years, both Van Halen and Roth always spoke openly about their differences with each other. When Roth appeared on Mark Maron's WTF podcast, he described his early relationship with the Van Halen brothers as crosstown adversaries who hated each other with a vengeance. Roth went on to summarize the Van Halen style as artisanal, super small batch Scotch craft. If we're running with that metaphor, one could say that Roth is a giant frozen banana daiquiri topped with several maraschino cherries, a few cocktail umbrellas, a novelty silly straw, and an extra floater of rum. When Roth appeared in the Opie and Anthony show in 2013, he mentioned that there was tension between him and Van Halen from the very beginning.
Conflict was immediate.
From day one. Oh, really?
And sustained from day one.
For 35 years off and on.
In a 2015 Billboard interview, Eddie Van Halen made a few cutting remarks of his own about Roth. He said, "There are 4 people in this band, and 3 of us like rock and roll, and 1 of us likes dance music." Van Halen went on to say, "Roth's perception of himself is different than who he is in reality. We're not in our 20s anymore, we're in our 60s. Act like you're 60. Despite their musical and personal differences, Van Halen admitted, however, that the fans' expectations included Roth. "I think it's now built into people's DNA that it just won't be Van Halen if it's not Roth's voice."
In addition to his legacy as the man who changed the electric guitar forever, Van Halen also served as a pop culture touchstone, inspiring everything from a claymation guitar-playing Hamburger in 1985's Better Off Dead to Bill and Ted's air guitar riff Handshake and their dream of recruiting Eddie to play in Wild Stallions in 1989's Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Well, how can we have decent instruments when we don't really even know how to play? That is why we need Eddie Van Halen.
There are also several references to Van Halen in 1985's Back to the Future, including a scene in which Michael J. Fox as Marty McFly has gone back in time to the 1950s to impart some information to his nerdy teenage father. To make his point and scare Teen Dad into listening to him, Marty dons a hazmat suit, pulls out a cassette tape labeled Edward Van Halen, and awakens his father with some distinctly 1980s guitar riffs.
Silence, Earthling! My name is Darth Vader.
The music from the Edward Van Halen tape sure sounds like the work of Eddie Van Halen, but was it actually him? In 2012, TMZ finally got the answer to this question once and for all. A TMZ reporter / obvious Van Halen fan followed the band through an airport and onto an escalator to ask Eddie about the alleged cameo. The reporter took the opportunity to clear up the Back to the Future trivia once and for all, asking if it is indeed Edward Van Halen on the cassette tape. Eddie confirmed with a calm, matter-of-fact, yeah. When asked what music he was playing, Van Halen admitted that he was just, quote, playing a bunch of noise. Typical modesty from the man who often let his guitar do all the talking, and also not entirely true. The bunch of noise has a name and was even used in another movie. According to Van Halen News Desk, it's a song called Out the Window, and it also appeared in the 1984 film The Wildlife. According to IMDb, the movie is an 80s teen romp written by Cameron Crowe with the tagline, "After the hottest summer of their lives, getting back to basics was easy. Getting back to normal was the hard part." Upon its release, the New York Times called it, quote, something like a sequel to 1982's Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Meanwhile, for Ultimate Classic Rock, Eddie Van Halen scored the entirety of The Wildlife, including Out the Window. His original musical role was supposed to be small, but he ended up, quote, recording searing guitar riffs over drum machine tracks that appear throughout the movie. The score was never officially released, and just one Van Halen song, an instrumental called Donut City, appeared on the Wildlife soundtrack. This didn't seem to bother Eddie Van Halen, who said, quote, "We were concerned about doing stuff for the film, not selling a record." Later, Eddie incorporated pieces of the Wildlife's score into several Van Halen songs, including Right Now and Feels So Good.
With David Lee Roth on vocals and Eddie Van Halen on guitar, Van Halen jumped into the music scene in the late 70s. But just a few years later, Roth jumped right out of the band as they peaked. Here's why David Lee Roth really left Van Halen. When you have a band named after you like Eddie Van Halen does, you probably want to have a say in the direction your group is headed in. That became more and more clear as the band's popularity surged. Roth wanted to keep things loose and fun, while Eddie wanted to become more diverse and music-oriented. The friction really came to a head during the tour for their massive hit album 1984. Once Roth departed, the barbs flew. When Eddie discovered that Roth was working on a movie prior to his Van Halen departure, he publicly said, "Dave left to be a movie star." He also revealed that Roth even boldly asked if Eddie would write a film score for him, so it's probably fair to say that being in a band with Eddie Van Halen may not always be rainbows and sunshine.
For Edward and I, there is a lot of whatever that chemical is in guys.
When Van Halen toured in 1978 as Black Sabbath's opener, they were on the upcrest of their meteoric rise. Sabbath, however, was declining, both musically and physically. Drugs were partly to blame. What Van Halen could have learned from that cautionary tale was presumably obscured by their own substance excesses. One instance saw Roth and Ozzy Osbourne having a cocaine duel that ended with Ozzy missing for hours and a canceled gig. Additionally, Van Halen became known for chugging Jack Daniels from the bottle during their shows. Other members of the band, like Eddie, would treat their burgeoning addictions more quietly. He would often get drunk or do coke privately and use those as his muses. Thus, even the habits of their substance abuse magnified their inherent differences. Roth was the type to get drunk on stage and hit on girls, while Eddie was the kind to sit under the influence in his room with his guitar. Eddie Van Halen constructed the studio of his dreams for the band in 1983 with the help of producer Don Landy, who helped engineer the first few VH albums. He called his studio 5150, and every album the band did from then on was recorded there, That included 1984, the album that propelled the band into superstardom. But that album, and the circumstances surrounding the band at the time, would help push Roth to quit the band, and the actual studio itself was a major reason for his decision. Roth believed Eddie had too much control over the overall creative process in the studio, and it turns out that's partly why Eddie built it. He hated the way previous Van Halen producer Ted Templeman made a record. Templeman loved having the band do cover songs while Eddie wanted to make his own music. The producer turned a beloved riff of Eddie's into a cover of Dancing in the Street, which was the last straw for Eddie. He no longer wanted to be known for singles or other people's hits. Although Templeman would still help with the making of 1984, it was clear to everyone that he was operating in Eddie's house now. One person who was hearing a lot from Eddie's side of things was Kiss bassist Gene Simmons, who actually got the band their first big break. Eddie kept telling his mentor how he and Roth were increasingly at odds, and around 1982, things apparently got bad enough that, according to Simmons, Eddie began asking to join Kiss. Simmons said that he persuaded him that it wouldn't be a good fit though. Kiss guitarist Paul Stanley says it never came that close to actually happening, but they both agree that Eddie and David were not getting along at all, and it was becoming public knowledge. The rumors of Eddie nearly joining Kiss are something Eddie downplays, saying that even if the notion had been brought up, he likely would have been joking or under the influence. However, in Roth's autobiography, he seems to think it was a very real episode and that Simmons was actively trying to recruit Eddie for Kiss, even before 1982. When Eddie jammed with Simmons once in 1977, several of those jams became Kiss songs, and Simmons even made Kiss guitarist Ace Frehley learn one of Eddie's solos note for an album. Roth already had a successful solo debut EP under his belt, 1985's Crazy from the Heat, before he decided to leave Van Halen. But the singer had his sights set on something bigger than music. He wanted to dip his toes into acting, and judging from his charismatic music videos, he might have been able to pull it off. He already had a movie project in mind, a semi-autobiographical tale of a rock star named Dave who gets into all sorts of shenanigans with his manager on the beaches of Dongo Island. Think Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but with bikinis. Roth even kept Eddie Van Halen in mind to do the soundtrack before the band folded officially in the summer of 1985. Eddie declined the offer. Still, storyboards were drawn up and a cast was assembled to begin production. Sadly, CBS, with whom Roth had the movie deal, was changing things up and canceled production of several upcoming movies, including Roth's pet project. He sued CBS and pocketed a settlement, but the movie was never made, and it was too late to save his relationship with Van Halen.
In the days immediately following Eddie Van Halen's death, the big news was that former Van Halen singer Sammy Hagar quietly buried the hatchet with his ex-bandmate in early 2020. During an appearance on Howard Stern's SiriusXM show, he opened up about how his relationship with Van Halen had become a, quote, love fest since they got back in touch. But they didn't want to get fans' hopes up for a Van Halen reunion that was likely never going to happen. So they kept it quiet. Sadly, Hagar also talked about how Van Halen had apparently become too weak to reply to his texts during the final month of his life. He said, "He stopped responding to me a month ago. And I figured it wasn't good. I reached out one more time last week, and when he didn't respond, I figured it was a matter of time. But it came way too soon." 2 months after his interview with Stern, Hagar spoke to Variety and dropped additional information on the bittersweet reconciliation with Van Halen. According to the veteran musician, comedian George Lopez helped the two get reconnected. He was the one who gave Eddie's contact information to Hagar and informed him that the guitarist wanted to reach out. While Hagar reconciled with Van Halen, unfortunately former Van Halen bassist Michael Anthony, who last played with the band in 2004, did not. Before Anthony's final tour with the group, he supposedly had to sign away his rights to Van Halen's name and logo and take a pay cut. Eddie had previously asserted that Anthony left the band of his own volition, but Anthony told Music Radar in 2009 that he, quote, never quit. In January 2021, Anthony revealed that he and Van Halen hadn't spoken for several years. At the time of Halen's death, he said, "It kind of bothers me, because we had some issues that were never resolved. But, I mean, what can you do? We were on track for a reunion. I'm really sad that it never happened. But you know, life and the show goes on." The reunion Anthony was referring to was the Kitchen Sink Tour, an endeavor that was first cooked up in 2018 by Van Halen manager Irving Azoff. There were plans for Anthony and former vocalists Hagar and Gary Cherone to perform on the tour. But the shows never took place due to Eddie Van Halen's declining health. The fact that Eddie Van Halen had battled different types of cancer for about 2 decades before his death was well documented. Initial reports following his passing noted that he had died of throat cancer, and that back in 2000, he had been diagnosed with tongue cancer. He blamed this condition on his habit of holding metal guitar picks in his mouth. However, TMZ obtained a copy of the guitarist's death certificate in December 2020, which revealed that his immediate cause of death was a stroke. He was also suffering from skin cancer of the head and the neck, as well as atrial fibrillation, which increases the risk of stroke by causing an irregular heartbeat. TMZ also released certain information that was supposed to remain private, including plans for Eddie's memorial. The late rocker's son, Wolfgang Van Halen, took to social media to blast the publication for revealing such details without his family's permission. If you with family, especially my father who is unable to defend himself, you with me. It's my job to do so now and I'll never stop. So if you've got a problem with that, you can either learn how to get over it or unfollow me. Van Halen and Mammoth WVH couldn't be more different in terms of sound.
I guess I just lucked out that the music that comes from my heart doesn't sound like it's ripping off my family lineage.
Still, Mammoth WVH is one of a handful of proudly old-school rock acts in an era of music dominated by genres other than rock and roll. And it's not surprising that Wolfgang Van Halen picked up quite a lot from his old man in terms of musical influence. But not too much. Wolfgang told Ultimate Classic Rock, "He never really tried to push me into any direction. I think the only thing he really introduced to me was AC/DC. The album Power Age was a big bond for us. Down Payment Blues. That was my dad's and my favorite song. But from there, I kind of developed my own taste." Eddie Van Halen frequently claimed that Peter Gabriel's 1986 album So was the last record he had ever purchased. Wolfgang backed it up, telling Ultimate Classic Rock that Eddie loved the album so much that it was the only one he truly insisted his son should listen to. And it looks like Wolfgang feels the same way, as he considers So to be one of his all-time favorite albums.
Perhaps the most notorious Van Halen situation was the recurring disappearance and reappearance of lead singer David Lee Roth. David and Eddie had a famously fractious relationship. The lead singer always wanted to be the rock star at the center of everyone's attention, while the guitarist was more about the music than the trappings of fame. Tensions ramped up between the two during the making of the 1980 album Women and Children First, particularly when it came time to shooting the album cover and inset photos with provocative fashion photographer Helmut Newton. Per Q Point, the Van Halen brothers, quote, viewed this whole episode as an effort by Roth to hijack the band's image for the new album, and disliked working with Newton. Another photographer ended up shooting the cover and insets, but a Newton portrait of Roth was made into a poster that was tucked into the first 1 million copies of the album. The rest of the band was displeased. Despite the dust-up over the photography for Women and Children First, the band seemed to know that it had something special going on, creating 2 more albums before their most iconic of all, 1984's 1984. By the time the band was ready to record, Eddie Van Halen had finished constructing his personal music studio with engineer Don Landy, which he named 5150 Studios. Eddie was unhappy with the number of cover songs on the 1982 album Diver Down, as well as the influence of producer Ted Templeman for Ultimate Classic Rock. He reportedly wanted more control and to, quote, show Ted that we could make a great record without any cover tunes and do it our way. According to Van Halen, 1984 was me showing Ted how you really make a Van Halen record. Eddie was the driving force behind the single Jump, which is probably Van Halen's most beloved, well-known song, as well as their only #1 hit. Eddie was particularly keen on the song's synthesizers, which David Lee Roth disliked. According to Van Halen, when I first played Jump for the band, nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. Dave said that I was a guitar hero and I shouldn't be playing keyboards. Roth then later tried to respond by enforcing his personality on the band's videos, wanting to make a video for Jump featuring him in a wide range of rock star moments, reports Ultimate Classic Rock. It didn't happen. Roth directed the video, but it simply features the band performing on stage. Despite the success of the album, video, and single, Roth was unhappy, as the success of the album seemed to put Van Halen in creative control of the band. Roth left Van Halen after a 1985 Summit meeting in which he announced that he couldn't work with the band anymore. Eddie responded by announcing, I'm looking for a new lead singer. It's weird that it's over. 12 years of my life putting up with this bull. Little did he know that it was far from over and that he and Roth would spend many more years breaking up and getting back together. Per Ultimate Classic Rock, Sammy Hagar replaced David Lee Roth and stayed with Van Halen for 11 years. during which the band had its first #1 album on Billboard with 1986's 5150, followed by the successful OU812 and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. The Van Hagar era came to an end when Hagar either quit or was fired from Van Halen.
The tour ended. I walked off stage and went that way. Eddie went that way. Mike went that way. Al followed Eddie.
The band teased a Roth reunion at the 1996 MTV Video Music Awards, but he only returned for 2 new songs for 1996's Best Of Volume 1. For a brief moment, it looked like Mitch Malloy would step up to the mic, but instead, Extreme's Gary Cherone took the lead singing position for 2 years and 1 album, 1998's Van Halen 3. After Cherone was let go, Sammy Hagar came back for his own 2-song reunion in 2004, as well as a tour. The tour went badly, and Hagar was out again. The final version of Van Halen came together in 2007, with David Lee Roth once again getting back behind the mic, and Eddie's son Wolfgang Van Halen stepping into the bassist role that had previously belonged to Michael Anthony since 1974. The band recorded the album A Different Kind of Truth in 2014 and toured for the last time in 2015. Van Halen was one of the greatest rock and roll acts of the 1980s, but not everyone loved the band's instantly recognizable style and one-of-a-kind guitarist. Whether they didn't like the music or they didn't like the man, these musicians weren't crazy about Eddie Van Halen. One of the most influential and skilled guitarists to come out of the 1960s and early 1970s was Jerry Garcia, the chief musical architect of the Grateful Dead. One of the most impressive electric guitarists of the 1970s and 1980s was Eddie Van Halen, the exceptionally proficient centerpiece of the hard rock foursome Van Halen. While both are among the most famous and acclaimed guitarists of all time, their musical approaches and techniques couldn't be more different. Van Halen's ultra-fast riffs didn't exactly impress Garcia, who publicly declared that he didn't listen to their records during a 1985 interview with Fret's magazine. He elaborated, "I can hear what's happening in there. There isn't much there that interests me. It isn't played with enough deliberateness, and it lacks a certain kind of rhythmic elegance that I like music to have, that I like notes to have. There's a lot of notes and stuff, but the notes aren't saying much, you know?" Garcia wasn't the first or last person to call out Van Halen's signature style.
It's music theory, not music fact, and there are no rules.
In 1977, Fleetwood Mac released Rumors, a soft rock opus about the band members' romantic squabbles that went on to become one of the biggest-selling albums of all time. The year after, Van Halen released its self-titled debut, a loud and heavy collection that rocketed the band to the top of the rock world. Fleetwood Mac's lead guitarist, Lindsey Buckingham, declared his style of play, which pulled heavily from folk music and banjo-picking methods, to be antithetical and superior to Eddie Van Halen's two-handed technique. In 2012, Buckingham told Guitar World Acoustic that he found Van Halen's style to be far too showy, saying, "I've always believed that you play to highlight the song, not to highlight the player. The song is all that matters." Buckingham got a bit more pointed as he called out Van Halen directly, continuing, "There are 2 ways you can choose to go. You can try to be someone like Eddie Van Halen, who is a great guitarist, a virtuoso, yet he doesn't make good records because what he plays is totally lost in the context of this band's music." In June 1980, Van Halen played a show in Leicester, England, the same night the progressive rock band Rush was in town. Rush rented out a bar to celebrate, and Van Halen's road crew crashed the party. Van Halen singer David Lee Roth told Cream in 1981 they cleaned the place out, which put their guys on edge a little bit. Nevertheless, Rush bassist Geddy Lee let the members of Van Halen into the bar and talked with Eddie Van Halen. Things didn't end well. Roth continued, "They'd both been drinking a little bit, and Geddy was playing some Rush tapes on a tape recorder. He said something to Ed, and Ed's beer got into the tape recorder. That caused a little friction. A year later, Lee and his bandmates tried to have their revenge. Rush opened for Van Halen in Las Vegas in 1981 and ended up telling the venue not to let anyone associated with the headliner in to see Rush play. The band's crews talked it out, and Rush relented, allowing a few guys to see their part of the show. Late that night, after both bands played their sets, Lee approached Eddie Van Halen in a casino with his hand out, seeking to make amends. Instead, he got slammed to the ground. Roth recalled, "One of our security guards didn't have the vaguest idea in hell who he was, and he came up and body tackled him." 2 fast-fingered electric guitar kings reigned over early 80s hard rock, Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads, the lead guitarist for Quiet Riot and Ozzy Osbourne. Van Halen and Rhoads seemingly resented one another, while also possibly learning from one another. Van Halen claimed some amount of responsibility for Rhoads' style, once saying, He was one guitarist who was honest anyway, because I read some interview he did and he said everything he did he learned from me. Van Halen may have been referring to a 1982 interview with Guitar World, in which Rhodes said, "As of yet, I don't think I have my own style. For instance, I do a solo guitar thing in concert, and I do a lot of the same licks as Eddie Van Halen. Eddie is a great player, but it kills me that I do that." 40 years later, Osbourne cleared the air for Rolling Stone, refuting Van Halen's take. As he put it, "I heard recently that Eddie said he taught Randy all his licks. He never. To be honest, Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie. Maybe they had a falling out or whatever, but they were rivals." Nevertheless, Van Halen tried to be respectful following Rhodes' tragic death at the age of 25.
He might be up there jamming with Bonham and everyone else.
Hip-hop blew up in 1988, with NWA releasing their controversial LP Straight Outta Compton, and pop rapper Tone Loc unleashing Wild Thing. The latter reached number 2 on the Billboard Pop chart and became the first rap single to sell more than 1 million copies. Tone Loc and producer Matt Drake built the song around a sample, the gritty guitar riff from Van Halen's 1978 single, Jamie's Cryin'. The legalities and protocols for sampling in hip-hop hadn't yet been fully established, and neither the rapper, the producer, nor the record label had gotten permission from Van Halen to utilize Jamie's Cryin' in Wild Thing. The band filed suit and would ultimately settle out of court, receiving about $200,000. That didn't quite satisfy Eddie Van Halen, who, long after the case was over, confronted Tone Loc during a chance encounter. Tone Loc told Billboard, "I ran into Eddie Van Halen one time. He was uptight and a little tipsy, claiming that I took money from him. I don't think he really believed that, but maybe he did because he was tipsy, and you say what you feel when you're in that zone. Maybe he didn't get the proper royalties for it. I don't know. He's lucky I didn't sock him in his jaw." After the early 2000s departure of guitarist Wes Borland from the nu metal group Limp Bizkit, a record label employee recommended that the band's frontman Fred Durst link up with Eddie Van Halen. According to Andrew Bennett in his book Eruption in the Canyon, 212 Days and Nights with the Genius of Eddie Van Halen, the two agreed to hang out and jam together at Durst's house in Beverly Hills. It descended into a well-attended party atmosphere, but when people began smoking marijuana, an irritated Van Halen abruptly departed without even packing up his guitars and amplifiers. A day later, Van Halen called Durst to arrange for a time when he could pick up his equipment. Durst didn't respond to Van Halen's requests, so the guitarist decided to retrieve his belongings in a much more aggressive way. He drove an assault vehicle that he'd purchased from an auction to Durst's home, and when Durst came to the door, Van Halen held a gun to the musician's face, demanding the return of his gear. While one of Durst's helpers scrambled to get Van Halen's stuff, the guitarist smoked a cigarette and continued to point the gun at him. Thankfully for everyone, the incident ended without further escalation. There were plenty of tumultuous lineup changes in Van Halen in the 1990s and 2000s. Sammy Hagar was out, then David Lee Roth returned. Then they were both out briefly in favor of their legendarily ill-fated replacement, Gary Cherone, and then Roth came back again. Other rock stars took sides in the lengthy feud, including Dee Snider, frontman of the glam rock group Twisted Sister, who proclaimed himself to be firmly in the Hagar camp. He blamed Eddie Van Halen for all the messiness, and revealed some of his less than flattering opinions about the guitarist. Snider told Ultimate Classic Rock in 2015, "Sammy's the real deal. He's talented, and he's a badass." Snider revealed that during one of Hagar's stints with the band, Eddie Van Halen instructed a crew to build walls in arena backstage areas so he wouldn't have to interact with the singer more than absolutely necessary. Snider admitted that the guitarist was an eccentric, to say the least, saying, "Eddie's out of his mind. I don't know. Has anybody seen the thing where he just showed up and started jamming with some Mexican band in a restaurant and his boots were so destroyed that his toes were hanging out in his toenails?" That was par for the course, according to Snider, whose son saw Van Halen play at a school in the 90s as a favor to a student's parent. Snider quipped, "He said that he looked like a homeless person, and I've heard that from so many people."
You know Jump, you know Panama, but did you know Eddie Van Halen could rock as hard with a power drill as he could a guitar? Here's everything you didn't know about Van Halen's iconic guitarist. When Eddie Van Halen emigrated to the US from the Netherlands in 1962, English was not his first language. He and his brother Alex endured all kinds of bullying at the hands of school kids who saw them as different due to their background. During a 2015 audience Q&A at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., Eddie described his first day of school in America as absolutely frightening.
They would tear up my homework papers, make me eat playground sand.
Unfortunately, the Van Halen brothers had also experienced something similar in their homeland. They'd suffered racist abuse in Europe as the children of Dutch and Indonesian immigrants. Across the pond in sunny California, the language barrier only gave more fodder to their bullies. The school, Eddie said, was still segregated at the time, and because he and his brother couldn't speak English, they were considered a minority. Today, Eddie Van Halen is known as one of the great guitar heroes of the 70s and 80s, but he actually began his musical journey on the piano. Both Eddie and Alex were instructed in classical piano from a young age, and Eddie won several consecutive piano competitions after the Van Halens arrived in Southern California. In a 2009 interview with Forbes, he said, "I took piano lessons from the age of 6 when we lived in Holland. When we moved to America, it was just the typical thing, except I was really good at it. So was my brother. I actually won 3 years in a row at Long Beach City College." In the end, Van Halen turned to the drums and then the guitar after hearing the Dave Clark 5.
Immediately we said, okay, enough piano.
His piano skills came in handy in the long run, however. He contributed keyboards to several of his band's hits, such as Jump and Right Now. Eddie Van Halen was always open about the fact that he never learned to read sheet music. This might seem strange for a professional musician, but it's also been true for a number of other legends over the years, including Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and all 4 Beatles. Van Halen had a finely trained ear that helped him mimic the sounds he heard and translate them to guitar. He had learned to do this when he took piano lessons as a young boy, playing by ear and watching his instructor's finger movements to map out his performances. According to Van Halen, he did this so effectively that he was able to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. Speaking to Forbes, he said, "Nobody ever knew that I couldn't read music. I fooled everyone because they always tripped. They're going, how come you're not looking at the sheet music? I was just blessed with good ears." During Van Halen's rise to stardom in the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had a unique nickname among his bandmates, Vard. According to David Lee Roth, the backstory behind the name was one of family ties, coined in honor of Van Halen's mother, Eugenia. However, Van Halen's special nickname served a different purpose when the rock outfit was out on the road together. In conversation, it helped Roth and the rest of the band differentiate the guitarist from Roth's security guard at the time, who was also named Ed.
His mother used the Dutch expression, or Dutch, the way she said it was Dutch. Het wacht.
While unknown to Van Halen fans upon its release, it later emerged that Eddie Van Halen had played drums on 1998's Van Halen 3, the band's only album with Gary Cherone as lead singer. Alex Van Halen, the band's mainstay drummer, didn't contribute to the album as he was going through his second divorce at the time. In a respectful nod from Eddie, however, Alex is still listed as the drummer in the album credits, but the album's producer Mike Post made no bones about Alex's absence when asked about it in 2024. Speaking on an episode of the Hustle podcast, Post explained that Alex was drinking to excess during his messy divorce, the impact of which came to a head during a recording session at Eddie's recording studio. Post recalled Eddie saying,
Well, I want him to think about himself and his family and to get straight and to figure things out and get his divorce finished.
It might sound crazy now, but Van Halen almost changed their name mid-career. The proposed name change was pushed by the group's record label, Warner Brothers Records, when Van Halen first swapped lead singers in 1985. Original lead singer David Lee Roth had left Van Halen to pursue a solo career, and Sammy Hagar became the outfit's new singer. Certainly, it would have been a risky move. Speaking about Eddie and Alex's reaction to the idea, Michael Anthony later recalled,
"We were at Warner Brothers and they were yelling, going, hey, this is our last name. This is our careers, and we're this is it, Van Halen."
Put on Van Halen's 1991 studio album For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, and you'll hear something strange. The opening track, Pound Cake, begins with something that sounds like an overpowered dentist's drill, subtly morphing into Eddie Van Halen's unmistakable shredding. That's because the sound indeed comes from a drill, a power drill to be exact. While experimenting in the recording studio, Eddie and his audio engineer devised this aggressive, uncharted guitar sound by having Eddie play his guitar with a power drill, specifically by placing the tool close to his guitar's pickups. What came out of the speakers is now considered a canonized rock intro among the Van Halen faithful, subsequently calling the experiment a goofball little thing. Eddie addressed his power drill playing in Kevin Dodd's book, Edward Van Halen, a definitive biography. He explained, "The motor of the drill got picked up by my guitar pickup, just like a microphone. I turned my volume on, and it sounded like kickstarting your engine." In 2015, Eddie revealed that the drill had been left sitting around by the studio maintenance technician, which led to Eddie picking it up and putting it to use. Eddie even used the same drill when Van Halen played the song in concert. Eddie's son, Wolfgang Van Halen, is now the leader of his own rock band, Mammoth WVH, so named in honor of Wolfgang's father and Van Halen's music. When Van Halen was still a fledgling act in Southern California in the early 1970s, one version of the band went by the band name Mammoth. Wolfgang added his initials to the name for a slight twist to make it his own. In a 2021 interview with Billboard, he said, "Since I was a kid, my dad would tell me the story of the band, and that it was called Mammoth. It was a three-piece with dad singing, so that's another connection I have with it. Just growing up, I was like, that's the coolest name. When I grow up, I want to call my own band that." And here we are. Aside from being close as family, Eddie and Wolfgang are also close musically. In 2007, when he was still only 16, Wolfgang replaced Michael Anthony as the bass player in Van Halen. The band essentially disbanded in 2020 following Eddie's death. Wolfgang premiered his new band later that same year with a debut single, Distance, which was dedicated to the memory of his dad.
When Eddie Van Halen died, he left a hole felt across the music industry. Despite their painful loss, Van Halen's family has gone to great lengths to honor the guitarist's legacy. On October 6, 2020, Eddie Van Halen died at Providence St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica due to complications from cancer. He had formed Van Halen with his brother Alex on drums, singer David Lee Roth, and Michael Anthony on bass in 1974. They began to climb to the top of the rock charts in the ensuing years, with Eddie's unique guitar style taking center stage. While Van Halen's career progressed, Eddie married actor Valerie Bertinelli in 1981, and the pair had a son named Wolfgang in 1991. Van Halen's lineup underwent many changes over the years, and Wolfgang eventually replaced Anthony on bass in 2007. The band officially broke up following Eddie's death, after permanently changing the music industry in their nearly 5-decade career. The guitarist first developed tongue cancer in 2000 and had part of his tongue removed. Doctors deemed Eddie cancer-free 2 years later, but in 2017 he developed stage 4 lung cancer, and in 2019 he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Ultimately, the cause of his death was a stroke, but he reportedly had several other contributing factors, including multiple cancers, pneumonia, and an erratic heartbeat. After he passed, his family had pizza, one of Eddie's favorite meals, in the hospital room to honor him. Wolfgang was by his dad's side when he died. As he recalled in an episode of Behind the Music, he was holding his father's hand as he passed.
Just felt the warmth of his hand on my face until I couldn't feel him anymore.
Wolfgang went on to say that Eddie's last words to him were, "I love you."
I was very happy I was able to spend every second with him that I could.
Wolfgang announced his father's passing in an Instagram post, writing, "He was the best father I could ever ask for. Every moment I've shared with him on and off stage was a gift. My heart is broken, and I don't think I'll ever fully recover from this loss." 22 days after Eddie's death, his family had his body cremated at LA's Forest Lawn Memorial Parks and Mortuaries. One of Eddie's final wishes was for his ashes to be scattered off the coast of Malibu, a place he used to live. Wolfgang honored his father's wishes and scattered the cremains in the Pacific Ocean, but he didn't scatter all of them. Instead, he had a necklace made that features his father's thumbprint and contains some of his ashes as well.
He's hanging on my neck. Every show I've ever played, he's with me all the time.
It's unclear if Eddie knew what his son planned to do with part of his remains. Regardless, following the final breakup of Van Halen, Wolfgang is focused on his music career with his solo project Mammoth WVH. He released his second full-length album, Mammoth 2, in 2023 and continues to tour extensively. While Eddie didn't live to see his son's success as a solo artist, he's on stage with his successor every time Mammoth WVH performs, thanks to that necklace.